The massive courtroom on Harmony Prime buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from dozens of alien species filled the curved seating areas, their various breathing apparatus and translation devices creating a symphony of mechanical sounds. Captain Jake Morrison adjusted his uniform and looked around the impressive chamber. The walls stretched high above them, covered in crystalline panels that displayed the symbols of every member species in the Galactic Council. Jake had seen many impressive sights during his years serving on human diplomatic missions, but this place still amazed him. The neutral station existed solely to house the Galactic Court of Species, where the most important legal decisions affecting multiple worlds were made. Today's case would determine the fate of 200 young aliens whose entire civilization had been destroyed. Dr. Lisa Parker sat beside Jake, her tablet displaying complex biological data. She had spent weeks studying the case files preparing for today's hearing. Lisa worked as a xenobiologist, someone who studied alien life forms, and she understood these young creatures better than most people in the room. Her research had uncovered details that others had missed or ignored. The Zephyrian cubs sat in a special viewing area behind thick, transparent walls. Jake could see them clearly from his position in the observer section. They looked much smaller than he had expected. The youngest appeared to be children, maybe 6 or 7 years old in human terms. The oldest seemed like teenagers. Their bodies were built for hunting, with sharp claws and powerful muscles. But something about their posture suggested fear rather than aggression. Ambassador Helen Brooks led the small human delegation. She had been working in galactic diplomacy for over 20 years and had seen many difficult cases, but this one troubled her deeply. The cubs had done nothing wrong except being born to a species that had terrorized other worlds for centuries. Now they faced punishment for crimes they never committed. The chief arbiter called the session to order. The ancient being belonged to a species that had helped create the galactic legal system thousands of years ago. Its voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of centuries of wisdom and experience. "We gather today to decide the fate of the remaining Zephyrian population," it announced. "These 200 young beings are all that survive of their species." Jake remembered reading about the cosmic disaster that destroyed the Zephyrian homeworld. A dying star had collapsed into a black hole, consuming their entire solar system in a matter of hours. The cubs had survived only because they were visiting other worlds with adult supervisors who died in the catastrophe. Now they were alone in a galaxy that feared and hated their species. The galactic prosecutor rose to present the case against the cubs. Vex 9 belonged to the crystalline species, beings made of living mineral who thought in terms of mathematical certainty rather than emotion. The Zephyrian species has caused immeasurable suffering across the galaxy, Vex 9 stated in its mechanical voice. Their raids have destroyed entire colonies. Their warriors have killed millions of innocent beings. These cubs carry the same genetic programming that drove their ancestors to violence. Representative after representative stood to speak against the cubs. The Avian Coalition described attacks on their peaceful trading posts. The Aquatic Federation told stories of underwater cities burned by Zephyrian raiders. The Silicon Collective presented data showing economic damage from centuries of Zephyrian piracy. Each testimony painted the same picture of a species born to kill and destroy. Lisa watched the cubs during these testimonies. She noticed things that others missed. When the avian representative described attacks on children, several cubs lowered their heads in what looked like shame. When images of destroyed cities appeared on the courtroom displays, some of the younger cubs covered their eyes. These were not the reactions of natural killers who enjoyed hearing about violence. "The question before this court is simple," Vex 9 continued. "Do we allow these predators to grow into the same monsters that plagued our galaxy for centuries? Or do we take action now to prevent future suffering? Science tells us that aggressive behavior is coded into Zephyrian genetics. They cannot help what they are." Several species representatives nodded in agreement. The Peaceful Herbivore Alliance had already called for the cubs to be placed in permanent containment facilities. The Advanced Civilization Consortium suggested sending them to isolated prison worlds. A few extremist factions had even proposed execution, though such suggestions were quickly silenced by the chief arbiter. Jake found himself thinking about Earth's own history. Humans had once been just as violent as the Zephyrians. Wars had raged across his homeworld for thousands of years. Children had been forced to fight in conflicts they never chose. Yet humanity had found ways to break cycles of violence and create peaceful societies. Why should these alien cubs be any different? Dr. Parker leaned over to whisper in Jake's ear. Look at their social behavior, she said quietly. See how the older ones protect the younger cubs? How they comfort each other during difficult testimonies. These are not the actions of mindless predators. The prosecution continued for hours. More species came forward to describe Zephyrian attacks. Historical records showed a pattern of violence stretching back over 1,000 years. The evidence against the adult Zephyrians was overwhelming and undeniable, but Jake kept watching the cubs and seeing something different from what the prosecutors described. As the day wore on, Jake noticed that none of the species representatives offered alternatives to punishment. No one suggested education or rehabilitation programs. No one mentioned the possibility that young beings might be different from their ancestors. The entire galaxy seemed convinced that these children were doomed to become monsters simply because of their biology. The chief arbiter finally called for closing arguments. Vex 9 stood once more to summarize the prosecution's case. The evidence is clear, the crystalline being declared. Zephyrian nature is unchangeable. For the safety of all civilized species, these cubs must be contained or eliminated. We cannot risk allowing them to mature into the same threats their ancestors represented. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Jake looked around and saw resignation on many faces. The verdict seemed obvious to most observers. These children would pay for crimes committed by adults they had never met, simply because they shared the same biology. The chief arbiter's voice rang out across the chamber. Before we proceed to deliberation, the court asks if any representative wishes to speak for the welfare of these young beings. Who will advocate for the Zephyrian cubs? The silence stretched longer. No species representative moved. No diplomat stood to offer an alternative. Jake felt his heart racing as he realized that 200 innocent children were about to be condemned because no adult in the galaxy was willing to speak for them. Every eye in the courtroom seemed to turn toward the human delegation, though Jake couldn't understand why. Humans had never fought the Zephyrians. His species was too new to galactic politics to have old grudges or historical conflicts. Perhaps that was exactly why everyone was looking at them now. Jake Morrison felt the weight of every gaze in the massive courtroom. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at Ambassador Brooks, who nodded slowly. She understood what he was thinking without words being spoken. Lisa Parker reached over and squeezed his arm, giving him the courage he needed. Jake stood up from his seat in the observer section. The sound of his chair moving echoed through the silent chamber like thunder. Hundreds of alien eyes turned to focus on the human captain as he stepped forward toward the speaking platform. Captain Morrison, the chief arbiter's ancient voice carried surprise. Do you wish to address this court? Yes, Your Honor, Jake said, his voice stronger than he felt inside. Humanity requests permission to speak for the Zephyrian cubs. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Alien representatives began talking loudly in dozens of different languages. Translation devices struggled to keep up with the sudden flood of communication. Some species representatives stood up in shock, while others leaned forward in their seats to get a better look at the human who had just volunteered for what many considered an impossible. Task Vex 9's crystalline form seemed to grow brighter with what might have been anger or amusement. The human delegation has no standing in this matter, the prosecutor declared. Earth has never faced Zephyrian aggression. Humans lack the experience necessary to understand the true nature of this threat. Jake walked to the speaking platform, feeling more nervous with each step. He had given speeches before, but never with stakes this high. Behind the transparent walls, he could see the Zephyrian cubs watching him with large, intelligent eyes. Some of the younger ones pressed their faces against the barrier, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Your Honor, Jake began, it is true that humans have never fought the Zephyrians. We are new to galactic society and have no old enemies or ancient grudges. Perhaps that gives us a different perspective on this situation. Dr. Parker joined him at the platform, carrying her research tablet. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, though she had never expected to be advocating for the cubs' freedom. If I may present our findings, she said to the chief arbiter. You may proceed, the ancient being replied. Lisa activated the courtroom's display system, showing brain scans and biological data that she had compiled over weeks of study. Our research shows that Zephyrian neural development does not complete until they reach adult maturity. The aggressive behaviors that characterize their adult population are learned responses, not genetic programming. She pointed to specific areas of the brain scans. These cubs show the same capacity for empathy, moral reasoning, and social bonding as any other sentient species. Their brains are still developing, which means their behavioral patterns can still be shaped through proper guidance and education. The Hegemony Council representative, a tall being with 4 arms and silver skin, stood to object. Even if this data is accurate, it proves nothing. These creatures will still grow into predators. Their physical capabilities alone make them dangerous to civilized society. Jake stepped forward again. With respect, that argument could be made about humans as well. My species has a long history of violence and warfare. We fought countless battles on our homeworld. We developed weapons capable of destroying entire planets, yet we learned to control our aggressive instincts and build peaceful societies. He gestured toward the viewing area where the cubs waited. Look at them. Really look at them. The older cubs are protecting the younger ones. They comfort each other when they're frightened. They show curiosity about the world around them. These are not the behaviors of mindless killers. Ambassador Brooks rose from her seat to join the presentation. Her decades of diplomatic experience showed in her calm, confident manner. Humanity proposes an alternative to the solutions presented by the prosecution. We volunteer to take custody of these cubs and establish a comprehensive rehabilitation program. The suggestion caused another wave of shocked reactions throughout the courtroom. Several species representatives began shouting objections immediately. The Peaceful Herbivore Alliance delegate accused humans of being naive and dangerous. The Silicon Collective representative questioned humanity's ability to contain potential predators. How can you guarantee the safety of the galaxy? Demanded the Aquatic Federation speaker. What happens when these cubs grow into adult killers? Will humanity take responsibility for every life they destroy? Jake felt the pressure of that question, but he stood firm. Yes, he said simply. If humanity is granted custody of these cubs, we accept full responsibility for their actions. We believe they can be more than their genetic programming suggests. Dr. Parker showed more data on the display screens. Our analysis of Zephyrian culture shows that their aggressive behaviors were primarily learned through warrior traditions and survival necessity. Remove those cultural pressures and provide proper education, and these young beings can develop entirely different behavioral patterns. The chief arbiter raised one ancient hand to restore order to the chaotic courtroom. The human proposal is unprecedented, the being observed. No species has ever requested custody of enemy young for rehabilitation purposes. Because no species has ever tried to see past their fear and prejudice, Jake replied. Every testimony today has focused on what these cubs might become based on their ancestors' actions. No one has considered what they could become with proper guidance and support. Lisa displayed images of the cubs engaging in various activities during their time in temporary holding facilities. They show remarkable intelligence and adaptability. Several have already begun learning Galactic standard languages. Others have shown artistic abilities and problem-solving skills that suggest they could contribute positively to society. One of the younger cubs pressed harder against the viewing barrier, and Jake could see tears in its large eyes. The sight strengthened his resolve to continue fighting for these children, who had already lost everything they had ever known. We're not asking this court to ignore the crimes committed by adult Zephyrians, Jake continued. We're asking you to give these children a chance to prove they can be different. Humanity has experience in breaking cycles of violence and hatred. We've helped child soldiers recover from trauma and become productive members of society. We've seen the worst of our own nature and found ways to overcome it. Ambassador Brooks presented the formal proposal documents to the court. The rehabilitation program would include comprehensive education, psychological counseling, and gradual integration into galactic society under strict human supervision. Regular inspections and progress reports would be provided to ensure transparency. The crystalline prosecutor's form grew even brighter. This proposal is madness, Vex 9 declared. The humans offer pretty words and wishful thinking, but they cannot change fundamental nature. When these cubs mature into killers, the blood of their victims will be on human hands. Jake looked directly at the prosecutor. Maybe you're right. Maybe we're making a terrible mistake. But isn't the possibility of redemption worth the risk? These are children who have already lost their families, their homes, and their entire civilization. If we condemn them now based on what they might become, what does that say about the justice we claim to represent? The courtroom fell silent again as the weight of Jake's words settled over the assembled representatives. Even the cubs seemed to sense the importance of this moment, pressing closer to the barriers that separated them from the adults deciding their fate. The chief arbiter studied the human delegation for a long moment before speaking. This court will consider the human proposal alongside the prosecution's recommendations. We will reconvene tomorrow to hear final arguments before rendering our decision. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the courtroom, Jake remained at the platform, looking at the cubs who would soon learn whether they had a future or faced a lifetime of imprisonment. One of the older cubs placed its hand against the barrier, and Jake pressed his own hand against the transparent wall in response. He had committed humanity to an enormous responsibility, but looking at these young faces, he knew it was the right thing to do. The second day of hearings began with Dr. Parker taking the witness stand. She had spent the entire night preparing her testimony, knowing that the cubs' lives depended on her ability to present clear scientific evidence. The courtroom was even more crowded than the day before, with representatives from species across the galaxy wanting to witness this unprecedented case. Lisa activated her presentation display and began showing detailed brain scans of the Zephyrian cubs. These neural pathway images demonstrate that aggressive behavior in Zephyrians is not hardwired into their genetics. She explained in simple terms that the translation devices could easily handle. The brain structures responsible for empathy and moral reasoning are fully developed and functioning normally. She pointed to specific areas highlighted in green on the brain images. These cubs show the same emotional responses to suffering and injustice as any other sentient species. When they see others in pain, their neural activity indicates genuine distress and desire to help. This is the opposite of what we would expect from natural predators without conscience. The Hegemony Council representative interrupted with a question. But surely their physical capabilities make them inherently dangerous regardless of their emotional development. Dr. Parker nodded and brought up new images showing Zephyrian physiology. Yes, they are physically powerful and possess natural weapons like claws and enhanced strength. However, many species in this courtroom have similar or greater physical capabilities. The crystalline people can generate devastating energy blasts. The Silicon Collective members can crush most materials with their bare hands. Physical ability alone does not determine behavior. She showed video recordings of the cubs interacting with their caretakers in the holding facility. Watch how they respond to stress and conflict. When younger cubs become frightened, the older ones comfort them rather than displaying dominance through aggression. When they compete for resources like food or sleeping areas, they negotiate and share rather than fighting. These are learned behaviors that can be encouraged and strengthened. Commander Alex Davis stepped forward to present the military aspects of humanity's proposal. He was a decorated officer who had served in several peacekeeping missions and understood the practical challenges of rehabilitation programs. Humanity has extensive experience in transforming individuals from violent backgrounds into productive members of society, he began. On Earth, we have successfully rehabilitated child soldiers, gang members, and individuals from war-torn regions. Our military academies regularly take young people with aggressive tendencies and channel those traits into positive directions like leadership, protection of others, and strategic thinking. Alex activated a holographic display showing the proposed facility on Haven Colony. The Zephyrian Integration Center would be built on a human frontier world with plenty of space and natural resources. The cubs would receive individual attention from trained counselors, educators, and mentors. They would learn useful skills like engineering, medicine, agriculture, and conflict resolution. The Peaceful Herbivore Alliance representative stood to voice concerns. What guarantee can you provide that these predators will not escape or revert to violent behavior? Our species has been victimized by Zephyrian raids for generations. How do we know they will not seek revenge when they mature? Commander Davis had anticipated this question. The facility would have comprehensive security measures, but our primary focus would be on making the cubs want to stay, rather than forcing them to remain. They would be given meaningful work, education opportunities, and the chance to build relationships with human families. Most importantly, they would be shown that they can have a future as valued members of galactic society. Jake Morrison returned to the platform to address the deeper philosophical questions raised by the case. This court must decide whether we believe in the possibility of redemption, he said, looking directly at the various species representatives. Do we judge individuals based on their own actions, or do we condemn children for the crimes of their ancestors? He gestured toward the viewing area where the cubs waited. These young beings have never harmed anyone. They have never chosen violence over peace. They have never had the opportunity to prove what kind of adults they could become. Yet many in this courtroom have already decided they must be destroyed or imprisoned for life. The chief arbiter leaned forward with interest. What precedent does humanity offer for such transformation? Jake was ready for this question. Throughout human history, we have seen warrior cultures transform into peaceful societies within a single generation. The Viking peoples of ancient Earth went from being feared raiders to becoming skilled traders and explorers. The samurai class in Japan evolved from military warriors into scholars and artists. Entire nations that were once enemies became close allies. He paused to let the translation devices catch up, then continued. The key factor in every successful transformation was the presence of adults who believed change was possible and were willing to provide guidance and support. These cubs need someone to believe in their potential, rather than fear their genetics. Dr. Parker returned to present her most important findings. I have been studying recordings of Zephyrian communications during their time in custody, she announced. With the court's permission, I would like to share some of their conversations. The chief arbiter granted permission, and Lisa played audio recordings with real-time translation. The cubs could be heard discussing their fears about the trial, their sadness over losing their families, and their hopes for the future. Most remarkably, several older cubs talked about wanting to help rebuild the damage their species had caused. They understand the harm their ancestors did, Lisa explained. They feel shame about their species' history and want the chance to make amends. This level of moral awareness demonstrates that they are capable of choosing different paths than their predecessors. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as a teenage cub named Crash spoke about wanting to become a doctor to help heal the wounds her species had caused. Another older cub expressed interest in studying engineering so he could help rebuild destroyed colonies. Their words carried genuine emotion and sincerity that could not be faked. Vex 9 rose to cross-examine the human witnesses. Even accepting your research as accurate, the crystalline prosecutor began, you are asking this court to gamble with the safety of billions of lives based on the hope that these predators will remain peaceful. What happens when they face stress, anger, or desperation? Will your rehabilitation survive the first real test? Commander Davis answered confidently. Every rehabilitation program faces that challenge. The difference is that we will not abandon these cubs at the first sign of difficulty. Human mentors will work with them throughout their development, helping them find healthy ways to handle negative emotions and stressful situations. And if you fail, Vex 9 pressed, if even one of these cubs grows up to commit violence, will humanity accept responsibility for every life lost? Jake stepped forward to answer the most difficult question of the trial. Yes, he said without hesitation. If humanity is granted custody of these cubs and our program fails, we will accept full responsibility for the consequences. We believe that strongly in their potential for positive change. The prosecutor's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been frustration. The humans offer noble words and good intentions, but they cannot guarantee success. This court must consider the risk to innocent lives across the galaxy. Ambassador Brooks rose for the final human statement. This court has heard testimony about Zephyrian crimes spanning centuries. You have seen evidence of destruction and suffering caused by adults who chose the path of violence. But you have also heard scientific evidence that these cubs are not doomed to repeat those choices. She looked around the courtroom at representatives from dozens of species. Humanity asks this court to choose hope over fear, rehabilitation over revenge, and justice over prejudice. These children deserve the chance to prove they can be better than their genetics and history suggest. The chief arbiter called for final arguments from all parties. As the day progressed, it became clear that the galactic community was deeply divided. Some species supported the human proposal, intrigued by the possibility of breaking cycles of violence. Others remained convinced that the cubs represented an unacceptable risk that could never be eliminated. As the session ended, Jake looked once more at the viewing area where 200 young lives hung in the balance. Tomorrow, the court would render its decision, and humanity would learn whether compassion and hope could triumph over fear and prejudice in the vastness of space. The decision came down like a thunderbolt that split the galaxy in two. By a narrow margin, the Galactic Court granted humanity custody of the Zephyrian cubs, but with conditions so strict, they made Jake's stomach churn. Any sign of violent behavior would result in immediate termination of the program. Regular inspections would monitor every aspect of the rehabilitation effort. Most importantly, humanity would bear complete responsibility for any future actions taken by the cubs, even after they reached adulthood. Jake stood in the cargo bay of the transport ship Aurora as the cubs were transferred from their holding facility to human custody. 200 young beings ranging from small children to teenagers looked around nervously at their new surroundings. Many clutched personal belongings saved from their destroyed homeworld. Others held hands with siblings or friends, finding comfort in familiar connections. Dr. Parker moved among the cubs with her medical scanner, conducting basic health checks while trying to ease their fears. She had spent weeks learning basic Zephyrian language patterns and could communicate simple concepts without relying entirely on translation devices. "Welcome," she said in their native tongue, causing several cubs to look up in surprise. "You are safe now." The journey to Haven Colony took 5 days through hyperspace. During that time, Jake watched the cubs begin to relax and explore their temporary quarters. The ship's recreational areas became gathering places where young Zephyrians played games that looked remarkably similar to human children's activities. They formed small groups based on age and interests, with older cubs naturally taking protective roles over younger ones. Lieutenant Sam Cooper joined the mission as the primary psychological counselor for the program. He had extensive experience working with traumatized children and had volunteered for this assignment despite the obvious risks to his career. Sam spent the voyage conducting individual interviews with each cub, assessing their emotional state and identifying those who might need additional support. "They're dealing with incredible trauma," Sam reported to Jake after the first day of interviews. "They've lost their families, their homeworld, and their entire culture. Many are suffering from survivor's guilt and depression, but underneath all that pain I see remarkable resilience and hope." Haven Colony appeared as a blue-green jewel against the starfield when they finally arrived. The frontier world had been selected specifically for the rehabilitation program because of its isolated location and abundant natural resources. The colonists had spent months preparing for the cubs' arrival, constructing dormitories, classrooms, and recreational facilities at the Zephyrian Integration Center. Jake felt nervous as he watched the colonial governor, Maria Santos, greet their ship at the landing pad. The colonist had agreed to accept the cubs, but he knew many harbored doubts and fears about living alongside young predators. Public opinion back on Earth was similarly divided, with some groups calling the program noble, while others demanded its immediate cancellation. The cubs emerged from the ship with obvious uncertainty, looking around at the alien landscape that would become their new home. Haven Colony featured rolling hills covered in purple grass, crystal-clear streams, and forests of silver-leaved trees that chimed softly in the wind. Several younger cubs immediately began exploring, their natural curiosity overcoming their initial fear. Dr. Parker had designed the integration center to feel more like a school campus than a prison. Individual living quarters provided privacy, while common areas encouraged social interaction. The educational facilities included both traditional classrooms and hands-on workshops, where cubs could learn practical skills. Most importantly, the entire complex was surrounded by open parkland rather than walls or barriers. The first weeks proved challenging in ways Jake had not anticipated. Several cubs struggled with nightmares and anxiety attacks as they processed their trauma. Others had difficulty adjusting to the lower gravity and different atmospheric composition of Haven Colony. A few older cubs tested boundaries and rules, perhaps expecting punishment similar to what they might have received in their original warrior culture. Sam Cooper worked tirelessly to provide individual counseling while also establishing group therapy sessions where cubs could share their experiences and support each other. He discovered that many had witnessed the final moments of their homeworld's destruction through communication links with family members who died in the catastrophe. The emotional scars ran deeper than anyone had realized. Educational progress came slowly but steadily. Human teachers worked with translation software to provide lessons in galactic history, science, mathematics, and languages. The cubs showed remarkable intelligence and adaptability, often grasping complex concepts faster than their instructors expected. Several demonstrated natural aptitude for engineering and technical subjects. Jake took personal responsibility for overseeing the program's daily operations. He moved his family to Haven Colony and established a permanent residence near the Integration Center. His wife, Carol, became involved in organizing recreational activities, while his teenage daughter, Beth, helped younger cubs learn human social customs and games. The real test came 6 months after their arrival. A group of older cubs, led by a teenager named Kresh, approached Jake with a request that surprised everyone. They wanted to visit the memorial sites of colonies that had been destroyed by adult Zephyrians in previous generations. They hoped to understand the full extent of their species' impact on the galaxy and find ways to make amends. Jake spent weeks arranging the visits through diplomatic channels. Many species initially refused to allow Zephyrian cubs near their memorial sites, but Dr. Parker's research data and progress reports gradually convinced some governments to grant permission. The first visit took them to New Harmony, a rebuilt avian colony that had been raided 50 years earlier. The cubs stood in complete silence before the memorial wall listing thousands of names. Several began crying as they realized the scope of suffering their species had caused. Kresh stepped forward and placed a hand-carved wooden flower at the base of the memorial, speaking words of sorrow and promise in her native language before switching to Galactic Standard. "We cannot change what our ancestors did," she said with tears in her voice, "but we promise to spend our lives trying to heal the wounds they created. We will be different. We will be better." The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, generating both positive and negative reactions. Some species representatives praised the cubs' sincerity and maturation, while others dismissed it as calculated performance designed to gain sympathy. The controversy intensified when several memorial sites began receiving similar requests from other groups of cubs. Commander Davis expanded the program to include practical training in search and rescue operations. The cubs' natural physical abilities made them excellent candidates for emergency response work, and they embraced the opportunity to use their strength and agility to help others. Within months, several were participating in actual rescue missions under careful human supervision. The crisis that Jake had been dreading finally occurred during the program's 18th month. A teenage cub named Rex was working on a construction project when another worker accidentally damaged something Rex had been building. The frustration and anger triggered an instinctive aggressive response that had been suppressed for months of training and therapy. Rex snarled and extended his claws, advancing on the human worker with obvious intent to cause harm. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like every critic's worst predictions were about to come true. The incident happened in full view of security cameras and several witnesses, making it impossible to hide or downplay. But then something remarkable occurred. Kresh and 2 other older cubs immediately intervened, not to join the aggression but to restrain Rex and calm him down. They spoke to him in rapid Zephyrian, using words and concepts from their counseling sessions to help him regain control. Within minutes, Rex had collapsed in tears, apologizing repeatedly and begging forgiveness for his momentary loss of control. The incident was reported to galactic authorities within hours, as required by the court's supervision agreement. Anti-program factions seized on the event as proof that the cubs could never be truly reformed. Demonstrations erupted on several worlds, with protesters demanding immediate termination of the rehabilitation effort. Jake found himself defending the program before emergency hearings while trying to support Rex through his psychological crisis. The young Zephyrian was devastated by his failure and begged to be removed from the program to protect the others. Instead, Jake and Sam worked with him to understand what had triggered the aggressive response and develop better coping strategies. Dr. Parker's analysis of the incident proved crucial to saving the program. Her medical scans showed that Rex's aggressive response lasted only 37 seconds before being overridden by his learned behavioral controls. More importantly, the other cub's immediate intervention demonstrated that the rehabilitation training was working exactly as intended. "This incident does not represent failure," Lisa argued before the emergency review panel. "It represents exactly the kind of success we hope to achieve." Rex felt anger and responded with an instinctive aggressive display. 2 years after the cubs arrived on Haven Colony, Jake Morrison stood before the Galactic Court once again. This time, however, he was not alone. 20 of the eldest cubs, now young adults, sat beside the human delegation. They wore simple blue uniforms that identified them as graduates of the Integration Center, and their calm, confident posture showed how much they had changed since that first terrifying day in court. Kresh had grown into a poised young woman who served as the unofficial spokesperson for her people. She had learned 6 galactic languages fluently and completed advanced studies in both medicine and diplomacy. As she took her place at the witness stand, Jake felt a surge of pride in what she and the others had accomplished. "Your Honors," Kresh began in perfect galactic standard, "I stand before you today not as the frightened child who once faced your judgment, but as a living example of what education, compassion, and second chances can achieve." The courtroom was packed with representatives from across the galaxy. Media coverage of the final review had drawn unprecedented attention, with billions of beings watching to see whether humanity's bold experiment had succeeded or failed. The Cubs' transformation over the past 2 years had generated intense debate in political and academic circles throughout civilized space. Dr. Parker presented the program's statistical results with obvious satisfaction. "Zero violent incidents in the past 18 months, she announced. 100% completion rate for basic education programs. 93% of program participants have chosen to pursue advanced training in fields that serve the galactic community. She displayed holographic charts showing the Cubs' progress in various areas. Psychological evaluations indicate stable emotional development and strong moral reasoning abilities. Medical scans show normal neural development with enhanced capacity for empathy and cooperative behavior. Most remarkably, stress response tests demonstrate that their fight-or-flight reactions now default to protective rather than aggressive behaviors. Commander Davis stood to present testimonials from the human colonists who had lived alongside the Cubs for 2 years. "Initial fear and suspicion have been replaced by genuine affection and respect," he reported. "Several Cubs have been formally adopted by human families. Others have formed close friendships that extend throughout the colony. They are valued members of our community, not dangerous outsiders requiring constant supervision." The prosecution had changed since the original trial. Vex 9 had been replaced by a more moderate crystalline prosecutor named Zara 4, who acknowledged the program's apparent success while raising practical concerns about long-term sustainability. "The results are impressive," Zara 4 admitted, "but this court must consider whether these individuals can maintain their reformed behavior when faced with greater challenges and temptations." Jake was ready for this argument. 2 months ago, our colony faced its greatest test when pirates attacked a civilian transport in our system. The Cubs volunteered immediately to join the rescue mission, despite having no obligation to risk their lives for strangers. He activated a recording showing the rescue operation. Young Zephyrians could be seen using their enhanced strength and agility to reach trapped passengers in damaged sections of the transport ship. Their natural hunting instincts had been channeled into tracking survivors and navigating dangerous environments to save lives, rather than take them. Kresh personally rescued 17 beings from a flooding compartment, Jake continued. Rex, the cub who experienced behavioral difficulties during his rehabilitation, carried an injured avian child to safety while under enemy fire. These young people chose to risk their lives protecting others, including members of species that had called for their execution. The rescue operation had been a turning point in galactic public opinion. Images of young Zephyrians cradling injured children and shielding elderly passengers from debris had been broadcast throughout civilized space. Even the most skeptical species representatives found it difficult to argue that the Cubs posed a threat to galactic security. Sam Cooper presented psychological profiles, demonstrating the Cubs' continued development. Their moral reasoning abilities now exceed galactic averages, he reported. They show enhanced empathy for suffering and injustice, likely developed through their own experiences of loss and prejudice. Most importantly, they have internalized principles of nonviolence and conflict resolution that guide their decision-making even under extreme stress. The chief arbiter asked the question that everyone wanted answered. What does humanity propose for the long-term future of these individuals? Ambassador Brooks rose to present the final phase of humanity's plan. We propose full integration into galactic society with the same rights and responsibilities as any other sentient beings. Several cubs have already been accepted into prestigious universities and training programs. Others wish to pursue careers in medicine, engineering, diplomacy, and public service. She gestured toward the cubs sitting in the witness section. They are no longer children requiring protection and guidance. They have become young adults capable of making their own choices and contributing to the greater good of galactic civilization. Kresh stood to address the court on behalf of her people. 2 years ago, you asked who would speak for the predator cubs, she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Today, we speak for ourselves. We have learned that our greatest strength lies not in our claws or our hunting instincts, but in our capacity to choose compassion over violence, service over selfish gain. She looked directly at the various species representatives, making eye contact with beings whose ancestors had been terrorized by adult Zephyrians. We cannot change our genetics or erase our species' history, but we can choose to write a new chapter, one defined by healing rather than harm, by building rather than destroying. Another young adult named Marcus stepped forward to share his personal story. I have been accepted into the Galactic Medical Academy, he announced. I plan to specialize in trauma surgery so I can save lives in crisis situations. My enhanced reflexes and strength, once considered threats, will become tools for protecting the innocent. Rex, the cub whose aggressive episode had nearly ended the program, spoke next. I have chosen to become a counselor for at-risk youth from violent backgrounds, he said quietly. My experience with anger and loss has taught me how to help others find better paths than the ones their genetics might suggest. One by one, the young Zephyrians shared their plans and dreams. Engineers who wanted to rebuild destroyed colonies. Teachers who hoped to work with orphaned children. Diplomats determined to prevent conflicts before they escalated into violence. Each story demonstrated how completely they had transformed from potential predators into dedicated servants of peace. The court's final deliberation lasted only 2 hours. When the chief arbiter announced the decision, the courtroom erupted in applause that continued for several minutes. The Zephyrian Integration Program was declared a complete success, and all participating cubs were granted full citizenship rights throughout human space with the option to apply for citizenship in other friendly territories. Dr. Parker was immediately contacted by universities wanting to study her rehabilitation techniques. Commander Davis received offers to establish similar programs for other conflict situations. Jake found himself appointed as the director of the new Galactic Youth Rehabilitation Initiative, with funding to help orphaned children from war-torn regions across the galaxy. But the moment that meant the most to Jake came after the formal ceremonies had ended. Kresh approached him with tears in her eyes and wrapped him in a careful hug, mindful of her natural strength. Thank you for seeing who we could become instead of who we were born to be, she whispered. 6 months later, Jake stood in another courtroom watching Kresh take her oath as the galaxy's first Zephyrian diplomatic attaché. She would be working with refugee children from the latest interstellar conflict, offering them the same hope and guidance that humanity had provided to her people. As the ceremony concluded, a group of new refugee children was brought into the courtroom. They belonged to a species that had been involved in generations of warfare, and their future seemed as bleak as the Zephyrian cubs had once appeared. The chief arbiter looked out over the assembled representatives and asked the familiar question. The court asks who will speak for these children, who will advocate for their welfare and potential. Kresh stood immediately, her voice strong and clear. I will speak for them, Your Honor, we all will. Behind her, dozens of former Zephyrian cubs rose to their feet, joined by human representatives and members of other species who had been inspired by the program's success. The courtroom filled with volunteers ready to prove once again that compassion could triumph over fear, that hope could overcome prejudice, and that every child deserved the chance to choose their own destiny. Jake smiled as he watched the new generation of advocates take their places. Humanity had started something remarkable, but it was spreading far beyond their control. The galaxy was finally learning that redemption was possible for anyone willing to believe in it, and children like these would never again face their future alone. The cycle of violence could be broken, one young life at a time, by adults